Today in this video I want to do something slightly different. I want to make an announcement. What it's about is a performance of my music that's coming up next month in Oxford. So if anybody is in the vicinity, any of my 10 subscribers I think it is, are in the vicinity and would like to come to Oxford to a concert featuring some of my music, then I'd be very pleased if they could do it. And obviously invite anybody else they know. The concert is on the 14th of November, and it's at Keble College Chapel. Keble College Chapel in Oxford. I'll put the details underneath in the box under the video, so you can check them. Keble College, Oxford, in the chapel. Actually, it's a very famous chapel. It's quite an interesting building. It's a very magnificent building by an architect called Butterfield, Victorian Gothic revival. And it's a concert by a choir called the Arcadian Singers. The Arcadian Singers are a chamber choir of students of Oxford University, and they're the premier student-organised chamber choir in the university. And they're very good, actually. They've done my music before, about 10 years or so ago. They did a piece of mine called 2 Blake Songs, which in fact is on this channel. If you look further back in the video section, you'll find a recording of the Arcadian Singers of about 10 years ago doing one of my 2 Blake songs. Anyway, they're doing a concert which is commemorating the centenary of the First World War, or the Great War as I usually call it. And it's going to be rather good, I hope. And it features choral music by various British composers, including me. Particularly, they're featuring a wonderful piece, one of my favourite pieces of choral music, the Requiem by Herbert Howells. Herbert Howells was a wonderful English composer who lived for a very long time. He lived into his 90s. He died in the early 1980s, I think it was, having been born in the 1890s. And he wrote some wonderful, wonderful choral music. It's really typical of the English choral tradition of the 20th century, which of course I feel myself to be quite strongly related to, and I'm influenced by people like Howells. And also two settings of For the Fallen, which is a very famous poem by Lawrence Binyon. And then they're going to be doing the first performance of my English Requiem. Now that is a short piece. It's only about 25 minutes long. And it's for choir with soloists and also an oboe and a harp. And it sets words from the Psalms. It's not a conventional requiem, it's not in Latin. It sets words in English from the Psalms, and also poems by English war poets from the First World War. Not the really famous ones like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, but 3 not very famous ones. One of them is Ivor Gurney, who's a very interesting figure, and I'll say more about him in a moment. The second one is Lawrence Binyon. Now, he wrote the famous poem that contained the words, "They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old," which they say on Remembrance Sunday. But he wrote quite a lot of other poetry, which is hardly known at all, and I've used one of his other poems. And then there are 2 short poems by a poet called Alec de Candolle, who actually I'd never heard of until just very recently, and he was killed in the First World War, and he wrote some beautiful poetry which I think ought to be better known. The poems are interspersed between sections from the Psalms, and I think it works quite well. I'll be interested to hear what it sounds like in an actual performance. It's very nice of them to do it, and so I hope people will come and support the Arcadian Singers in Oxford if they're anywhere near and able to come. And then also the concert features a short group of settings of Ivor Gurney poems called Severn and Somme. Severn and Somme is the title of a collection of poetry by Ivor Gurney. Now, Ivor Gurney was a very interesting figure. He was a poet and a composer, and he was equally at home in both areas. So he published a lot of poetry, and he also published quite a lot of music. And again, he's not that well known. He ought to be better known, both as a poet and a composer, I think. And he's having a little bit of a revival nowadays. His music was rather forgotten for quite a while, and his poetry, but I think he's getting a bit more attention nowadays, and hopefully I'll be contributing to that. Now, he had a very tragic life. There's no getting away from it. It was very tragic. He was born in Gloucestershire. He was a great friend of Herbert Howells, actually, the composer I mentioned earlier. and he was very promising. He was in the cathedral choir in Gloucester and went to the school there, King's School in Gloucester, and he went to the Royal College of Music, I think it was in London, and he was very promising. But he, like a lot of other people, got caught up in the First World War. He went to fight in the First World War, and he'd already before that shown some signs of mental instability. He was a highly strung and nervous person, and his experiences in the war affected him very, very badly, and he never really recovered. And he tried to go back to normal life after the war as a church organist and various other things. And in the end, his behaviour became more and more erratic and strange, and he started doing strange things. And he actually ended up in a mental asylum, and he spent most of the rest of his life in various mental hospitals, where he died in the 1930s. And it's very, very sad. But he did go on writing both poetry and music, and he set some of his own poems to music, but quite a lot of other poems of his he didn't set to music. And I thought it would be interesting. I think they're very moving poems. I thought it would be interesting to set some of them to music myself, and they fit in with the theme of this concert very well, and of the First World War. Now, the First World War, or the Great War, for me is very significant. I think it was probably the great cataclysm of Western civilization. After 1914, nothing was ever the same, and nothing is the same now. Nothing is the way it might have been now, even 100 years later, because of that war. It was a huge cataclysm. We all know that. There was a terrible loss of life, and it was also futile in some ways. And in the end, it only led to the Second World War 20 years later. And so it's not just the actual casualties and the destruction and so on, but it destroyed, in my opinion, and I think a lot of other people think this as well, it destroyed a kind of optimistic outlook on the world. Before 1914, especially in Britain, a lot of people were extremely optimistic about the future. They thought the world was getting better, we were going to eradicate illness, sickness and poverty and make a better society, and everything was going to be wonderful. People like Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, were part of that movement. And they and a lot of other people were terribly, deeply affected and disillusioned by the First World War. Russell started actually by supporting it, and by about halfway through he just changed his mind and he became an activist and a pacifist against the war. Anyway, so for me the Great War is very important. And also I have a possibly slightly unfashionable view about the First World War. I grew up with what became the standard view from about, actually fairly soon after the war, certainly from the 1930s onwards. It became standard to see the First World War as essentially an unnecessary war, a futile waste of life and effort, and causing a huge amount of destruction, and that it became standard to regard it as having been essentially a war between big powers, colonial powers, about who was going to control Europe and who was going to get colonies and so on. Well, there is some truth in that, and this version was put forward particularly by the historian A.J.P. Taylor here in Oxford and others, and also it was supported by the poetry of people like Wilfred Owen, who portray the horror and the pity of war. And there's no getting away from it. The horror and pity was terrible, and the experiences people went through were unspeakable, and a lot of the war poetry is very, very tragic. However, there's a sort of changing perspective on it, and some people have been talking about this recently, and I've been feeling the same, that although the First World War was a cataclysm, it would be far better if it hadn't happened, far better for all of us, and it was a terrible waste of life, and it was terribly destructive. I think you can argue that it wasn't actually as unnecessary as people say. A few years ago I came across, quite by chance, a book by a German general published in about 1912 called Germany in the Next War, and it's a most extraordinary book. It's just there in great detail. It's all about why Germany needs a war, why war is a good thing, how Germany is going to win the next war, how Germany is going to defeat Russia, France, Britain, etc., and how Germany is going to take over Europe. I mean, it's completely blatant, and it illustrates that the Kaiser's Germany, Imperial Germany, was essentially a military dictatorship, and they had been planning for years to have a war. They wanted a war, and they planned a war in order to to dominate Europe, and also because they believed that Germany deserved to have colonies like Britain and France. And they were completely cynical and ruthless in their plans. And when they did carry them out, they invaded Belgium, which was a neutral country, as part of their plan. They were warned if they did that Britain would go to war to defend Belgium, and that's what happened. Now you can argue about it, whether it was worth it or not, and given all the misery and death that ensued, but certainly in terms of the thinking of that time, it was an absolute obligation for Britain to go to the assistance of Belgium when they were invaded. Britain was one of the guarantors of Belgium's neutrality. When Belgium was formed as a country in the 19th century, Britain was one of the guarantors, and it was an absolute moral duty, if Belgium was invaded, for Britain to go to her assistance. So on that point alone, I don't see how Britain could have kept out of the war with any kind of decency. Now that's my personal opinion, and it's interesting to note that a lot of the war poets who actually fought in the war had a similar kind of attitude. Even people like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, certainly at the beginning of the war, they thought it was justified and necessary. They became more disillusioned later. But even very near the end of the war, just before his death, Wilfred Owen actually expressed some quite positive views about the war, which are not quite the same as those that he expresses in his poetry. So anyway, it's arguable. It's a slightly controversial subject, but my feeling is that we should respect the way that the poets felt at the time about it. And those poets for whom the war was horrible, but maybe necessary, and maybe a kind of a challenge, even a kind of spiritual challenge, to actually have the courage to go and fight for something that was important. That's how they felt about it. We may see it differently 100 years later, but I think that we should respect their point of view. So that's partly what I'm doing in these musical settings in the concert. I've chosen poems that are not necessarily anti-war. They're not. I mean, they reflect the tragedy of war, but they're not necessarily anti-war poems as well. And I'm not taking sides on this as such. But as a composer, I want to reflect. I want to take a slightly different kind of attitude, rather than something like Britain's War Requiem, which is basically about war and the pity of war, and it's a pacifist work. Basically, I'm saying war is terrible, but maybe sometimes it's necessary, and we should respect the experiences of the people within the war, and the way that at least some people try to find something, if you like, challenging, something a bit nobler in what they're doing. Whether you agree with that or not, maybe we should respect them. Anyway, that's my opinion, and it'll be interesting to see how people react to the music and my settings of the poetry. So I'm going on a bit too long here, but just to finish, what I thought I might do is read a couple of Ivor Gurney's poems, just to give you an idea of the feel of the work. And what's touching about his poetry is that for the rest of his life after the war, during the war, when he was in the trenches, he remembered the Cotswold Hills and the Severn River and the landscape of Gloucestershire where he grew up while he was in the trenches. When he got back home, he was constantly remembering the trenches. So that's why his collection of poetry is called Severn and Somme, because the two are kind of interwoven in his poetry in quite a strange way. Here's a poem called Strange Service, which is in the song cycle. Little did I dream, England, that you bore me under the Cotswold Hills, beside the water meadows, to do you dreadful service here, beyond your borders and your enfolding seas. I was a dreamer ever, and bound to your dear service, meditating deep, I thought on your secret beauty, as through a child's face one may see the clear spirit miraculously shining. Your hills, not only hills, but friends of mine and kindly, your tiny knolls and orchards hidden beside the river, muddy and strongly flowing, with shy and tiny streamlets safe in its bosom. Now these are memories only, and your skies and rushy sky pools, fragile mirrors easily broken by moving airs. In my deep heart forever goes on your daily being, and uses consecrate. Think on me too, O Mother, who rest my soul to serve you in strange and fearful ways beyond your encircling waters. None but you can know my heart, its tears and sacrifice. None but you repay. And then another short poem which I use in the Requiem is called Mist on Meadows. Mist lies heavy on English meadows, as ever in Ypres. But the friendliness is here is greater in full field and hedge shadow. And there is less menace and no dreadfulness, as when the very lights went up, to show the land stark, dreadful green light bearing the ruined trees, stakes, pools, lostness better hidden dreadful in dark. And not ever reminding of these other fields, where tall dock and clover is, and that sweet grass yields for that poisoned, where the cattle hoof makes mark, and the river drifts slowly along the leas. So there are two poems by Ivor Gurney. I think you get a feeling from them of the way that his life was haunted, both by the meadows and the river and the Cotswolds, and then by the experience of the trenches, and the two sort of interpenetrate. So they give you a little bit of a taste of the poetry used in these settings I've done. And as I say, it's concert in Oxford on 14th of November at 8 p.m. at Keble College Chapel, and I'll put the details down below. So thank you very much, and if you like this video and you'd like to subscribe to my channel, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.